The problem of evil. For centuries, skeptics have pointed to one observation that seems to unravel everything believers claim about God. If an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God exists, why does evil exist at all? The logic appears airtight. A being with unlimited power could prevent suffering, unlimited knowledge would see it coming, and perfect goodness would demand intervention. Yet children suffer, natural disasters destroy innocent lives, and cruelty persists across human history. This argument gained philosophical refinement through thinkers like Epicurus and David Hume, who formalized the logical problem. Either God cannot prevent evil, making him not all-powerful, or he will not prevent it, making him not all good. Many atheists consider this the strongest case against theism, an unanswerable challenge that exposes the internal contradiction at Christianity's core. The emotional weight adds power to the logic, turning abstract philosophy into lived, human pain. But the argument contains a hidden assumption that believers reject. It presumes that an all-knowing God would share our limited perspective on what purposes suffering might serve. Christian theology has long distinguished between evil's existence and evil's ultimate purpose, arguing that free will, moral development, and soul-making require the possibility of genuine suffering. The cross itself demonstrates God entering into human suffering rather than remaining distant from it. The problem of evil remains a profound question, one that demands serious engagement rather than dismissal. Yet the argument's logical force depends entirely on assuming we possess the knowledge to judge whether God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting evil. That assumption may be the weakest link in what appears to be an unbreakable chain. Lack of evidence for God. The courtroom standard seems clear enough. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and nothing could be more extraordinary than an invisible, all-powerful being who created the universe. Atheists argue that belief in God fails this basic evidential test. We cannot see God, cannot measure his presence with scientific instruments, and cannot produce him for examination. The evidence that convinced previous generations, from religious experiences to answered prayers, can be explained through natural causes without invoking the supernatural. This evidential argument forms the backbone of modern atheism's intellectual case. Where is the peer-reviewed scientific paper demonstrating God's existence? Where is the repeatable experiment that proves divine intervention? The absence of such evidence, atheists claim, places God in the same category as fairies, unicorns, and other imaginary beings. Rational people proportion their beliefs to available evidence, and the evidence for God simply does not meet acceptable standards of proof. Yet this framing contains its own unstated assumptions about what counts as evidence and where we should expect to find it. The demand for scientific evidence presumes that God, if he exists, would be detectable through the methods of natural science designed to study the natural world. But believers argue that God, as the source of nature itself, would leave evidence of a different kind. The universe's existence, its fine-tuning for life, consciousness, objective moral values, and the historical evidence for Jesus. These fingerprints of design may not fit into laboratory protocols, but they arguably constitute genuine evidence. The question becomes not whether evidence exists, but whether we have defined evidence too narrowly to recognize what a transcendent God would reasonably provide. Sometimes what we call absence of evidence reveals more about where we have been looking than about what might actually be there. What do you think about the evidence question? Share your perspective in the comments. Who created God? Children grasp this objection instinctively, and atheists wield it as a devastating counter to cosmological arguments. Christians claim everything needs a cause, therefore the universe needs God as its cause. But then atheists ask, who caused God? If God can exist without a cause, why not just say the universe exists without a cause and skip the middle step? The argument seems to expose a special pleading fallacy at the heart of theistic reasoning. This objection has become standard in debates and online discussions about God's existence. It appears simple, elegant, and logically airtight. Either everything needs a cause, including God, leading to an infinite regress of creators, or some things can exist without causes, in which case, why invoke God at all? The atheist concludes that positing God as the uncaused first cause solves nothing while adding unnecessary complexity to our explanations. But the objection misrepresents what cosmological arguments actually claim. These arguments do not say everything needs a cause. They say everything that begins to exist needs a cause. The universe, with its clear beginning point confirmed by modern cosmology, falls into the category of things that began. God, in classical theology, exists outside of time as an eternal, necessary being who never began and therefore needs no cause. The categories are fundamentally different. The question, who created God, only makes sense if God is the kind of being that could have been created. But if God is by definition the eternal, self-existent ground of all reality, asking who created him is like asking what happened before time began. The question itself contains a category error that dissolves upon closer examination. Biblical contradictions and errors. Open to nearly any page, skeptics claim, and you will find problems. The Bible presents two different creation accounts in Genesis, contradictory genealogies of Jesus, conflicting resurrection, narratives and historical errors that undermine its credibility. How many angels were at the tomb? How did Judas die? How many animals went on the ark? The list of apparent contradictions runs into the hundreds, compiled in atheist resources designed to demonstrate that Christianity's sacred texts cannot be trusted. These contradictions serve as powerful ammunition in debates, especially when believers claim biblical inerrancy or divine inspiration. If God wrote this book, atheists argue, it should be perfect. Instead, we find a messy collection of documents written by fallible humans across centuries, containing all the mistakes, cultural biases, and scientific ignorance we would expect from ancient authors. The Bible looks exactly like a human product, not a divine revelation. Yet biblical scholars have spent centuries addressing these alleged contradictions, and many dissolve under closer examination. Different gospel writers emphasizing different details does not constitute contradiction. It constitutes multiple witness testimony from various perspectives. Ancient biographies follow different conventions than modern ones, and apparent discrepancies often reflect literary techniques like compression, thematic arrangement, or complementary accounts rather than errors. The genealogies serve different theological purposes, tracing Jesus through different lines. The deeper question is whether we approach the text looking for reasons to dismiss it or reasons to understand it. Ancient documents require historical context, literary awareness, and charitable reading. What appears contradictory on the surface often reveals sophisticated narrative purposes underneath. The Bible's complexity may be evidence of its richness rather than its falsehood. What contradictions have you encountered, and how were they resolved? Let us know in the comments. Evolution and science make God unnecessary. Darwin's theory provided what atheists had been seeking for centuries, a mechanism to explain life's complexity without invoking a designer. Natural selection acting on random mutations could produce the appearance of design through purely naturalistic processes. No divine intervention required. The new atheism movement, led by evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, made this argument central to their case against God. Science explains what religion once claimed as mysteries. This argument extends beyond biology into physics, cosmology, and neuroscience. We once needed God to explain lightning, now we have meteorology. We once needed God to explain consciousness, now we have neuroscience. Each scientific advance seems to shrink God's territory, pushing him into an ever smaller gap in our knowledge. Eventually, atheists predict science will explain everything and the God hypothesis will become completely obsolete. Religion represents humanity's childhood. Science represents our maturity. But this framing fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between God and scientific explanation. Christianity does not claim God as a gap filler for scientific ignorance, but rather the reason why nature follows rational, discoverable laws in the first place. Evolution, if true, would describe the mechanism God used to create diverse life, just as embryology describes the mechanism God uses to create individual humans. Mechanism and meaning operate at different levels of explanation. Science excels at answering how questions, but cannot address why questions about ultimate purpose, meaning, and existence itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do the laws of nature take the precise form required for life? Science presupposes an orderly, intelligible universe, but cannot explain why such a universe exists. The more science reveals about nature's elegant complexity, the more it may point beyond itself to the source of that order. Problem of divine hiddenness. If God wants relationship with humanity, why does he remain hidden? This argument cuts deeper than the lack of evidence objection because it questions God's motives rather than just his existence. A loving parent would not hide from their children, yet God apparently conceals himself behind layers of ambiguity, leaving millions in honest doubt about his reality. If belief is necessary for salvation, divine hiddenness seems cruel rather than loving. The argument gained philosophical sophistication through J.L. Schellenberg's work, which argues that a perfectly loving God would ensure that all people capable of relationship with him would have enough evidence to believe. Yet we find sincere seekers who remain unconvinced, people who desperately want to believe but cannot, and entire cultures with little exposure to Christianity. This pattern contradicts what we would expect if a loving God existed and desired relationship with all people. Christian responses typically emphasize that God provides sufficient evidence while respecting human freedom. Too much evidence would overwhelm free will, turning faith into coercion. God reveals himself through creation, conscience, Christ, and personal experience, but not so overwhelmingly that genuine relationship becomes impossible. The hiddenness allows space for trust, for seeking, and for authentic choice rather than compelled acknowledgement. But perhaps God is less hidden than we think. The question may not be whether God has revealed himself, but whether we have been looking in the right places with the right expectations. Sometimes what we call hiddenness reflects our demands for a particular kind of evidence rather than God's actual absence. Share in the comments whether you have experienced God as hidden or revealed. Religious diversity and conflicting claims. Walk through different neighborhoods in any major city and you will encounter Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Christians, each convinced they possess the truth. They cannot all be right since they make contradictory claims about God's nature, salvation, and humanity's ultimate destiny. Yet each tradition points to religious experience, sacred texts, and transformed lives as evidence. The existence of mutually contradictory religions suggests that religious belief itself is unreliable, perhaps a human creation reflecting culture rather than divine revelation. This argument resonates in our pluralistic age. Christianity claims Jesus is the only way to God, while Islam rejects Jesus' divinity entirely. Hinduism embraces millions of gods, while Judaism affirms strict monotheism. These differences cannot be dismissed as minor variations on a common theme. They represent fundamentally incompatible views of ultimate reality. If God wanted to communicate with humanity, atheists ask, would he not ensure his message was unmistakable rather than generating thousands of competing interpretations? Christian responses often point out That religious diversity does not mean all religions are equally wrong. It could mean one is right while others contain varying degrees of truth and error. Mathematical equations can have many wrong answers, but still have one correct solution. The existence of counterfeit currency does not disprove the existence of genuine money. The fact that human beings across cultures sense the transcendent may itself be evidence that something transcendent exists. The question is not whether religious diversity exists, but how we interpret that diversity. Does it prove that all religions are human inventions? Or does it demonstrate humanity's universal hunger for transcendence, with different cultures grasping different aspects of a reality that Christianity claims was definitively revealed in Christ? The evidence cuts more than one direction. Jesus is a myth or copycat religion. Internet atheism popularized the claim that Jesus never existed or that Christianity stole its core ideas from earlier pagan religions. YouTube videos and online articles point to Egyptian, Persian, and Roman gods who allegedly were born of virgins, died and rose again, and share other similarities with Jesus. The conclusion: Christianity is just another iteration of common mythological themes, not divine revelation, but human plagiarism of older stories that also were not true. The mythicist position argues that Paul invented a celestial Christ, and the gospel writers later historicized this spiritual being into Jesus of Nazareth. No credible evidence for Jesus exists outside Christian sources, skeptics claim, and those sources were written decades after the alleged events by people with obvious bias. The silence of contemporary historians like Philo proves Jesus was not a real person making the claims attributed to him. Christianity emerges as an elaborate fiction built on borrowed mythology. Yet this position is rejected by virtually all credible historians, including non-Christian scholars. The historical evidence for Jesus includes multiple independent sources written within living memory of the events, hostile references from Jewish and Roman sources, and the otherwise inexplicable origin of the Christian movement. The alleged parallels with pagan gods dissolve under scrutiny. Most are exaggerated post-date Christianity or involve superficial similarities that ignore fundamental differences in historical context and theological meaning. The mythicist position thrives online precisely because it allows people to dismiss Christianity without engaging its actual historical claims. But the scholarly consensus across religious and secular historians alike affirms that Jesus existed, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and sparked a movement whose rapid growth demands historical explanation. The question is not whether Jesus existed, but how to explain the evidence we possess about who he was and what he accomplished. The problem of hell and eternal punishment. A loving God who tortures people eternally for finite sins seems morally monstrous, not perfectly good. This emotional and philosophical objection resonates deeply in contemporary culture. How could temporary unbelief or moral failures justify infinite conscious torment? Even human justice systems recognize that punishment should be proportional to the crime. Eternal hell for 70 years of doubt appears infinitely disproportionate, contradicting the very notion of divine love and justice that Christianity proclaims. Atheists argue that the doctrine of hell reveals Christianity's origins in fear-based control rather than divine revelation. What kind of father would burn his children forever for not believing the right propositions? The threat of hell looks less like justice and more like cosmic extortion. Believe or suffer eternally. This doctrine has driven countless people away from Christianity, not because they reject evidence, but because they reject a God whose character seems worse than the worst human tyrant. Christian responses vary widely, from defending traditional eternal conscious torment to proposing annihilationism or universal reconciliation. Some argue that hell is not God's torture chamber, but the logical consequence of rejecting relationship with the source of all goodness. a self-imposed separation that God sorrowfully allows. Others emphasize that biblical language about hell uses metaphor and that our cultural assumptions about afterlife punishment may not align with Scripture's actual teaching. The debate within Christianity itself shows the doctrine's complexity. The question may ultimately be whether love can coexist with allowing people to finally and definitively reject God. If human freedom matters, can God force relationship on those who want nothing to do with Him? The problem of hell challenges us to think carefully about divine justice, human freedom, and the eternal weight of choices made in time. Each argument carries initial plausibility, but also contains hidden premises that, when exposed, reduce their force. This does not mean atheism is unreasonable or that these questions have easy answers. It means that the conversation between faith and skepticism must continue with humility on both sides, recognizing that ultimate questions about existence, meaning, and transcendence may not yield to simple formulas or decisive proofs either direction. If you like our content, consider subscribing. Or some topics didn't made in the list or topics that you want us to feature, please leave in the comments.